Part 3, Chapter 5, Section 2 of Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated by Constance Garnett, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 3, Chapter 5, Section 2. "He is always humbugging, confound him!" cried Razumihin, jumping up and gesticulating. "What's the use of talking to you? He does all that on purpose. You don't know him, Rodion. He took their side yesterday, simply to make fools of them. And the things he said yesterday! And they were delighted! He can keep it up for a fortnight together. Last night he persuaded us that he was going into a monastery; he stuck to it for 2 months. Not long ago he took it into his head to declare he was going to get married, that he had everything ready for the wedding. He ordered new clothes indeed. We all began to congratulate him. There was no bride, nothing. All pure fantasy." "Ah, you are wrong. I got the clothes before. It was the new clothes, in fact, that made me think of taking you in." "Are you such a good dissembler?" Raskolnikov asked carelessly. "You wouldn't have supposed it, eh? Wait a bit, I shall take you in too. Ha ha! No, I'll tell you the truth. All these questions about crime, environment, children, recalled to my mind an article of yours which interested me at the time, 'On Crime,' or something of the sort, I forget the title. I read it with pleasure 2 months ago in the Periodical Review." "My article? In the Periodical Review?" Raskolnikov asked in astonishment. "I certainly did write an article upon a book 6 months ago when I left the university, but I sent it to the Weekly Review." "But it came out in the periodical." "And the Weekly Review ceased to exist, so that's why it wasn't printed at the time." "Well, that's true. But when it ceased to exist, the Weekly Review was amalgamated with the periodical, and so your article appeared 2 months ago in the latter. Didn't you know?" Raskolnikov had not known. "Why, you might get some money out of them for the article. What a strange person you are! You lead such a solitary life that you know nothing of matters that concern you directly. It's a fact, I assure you." "Bravo, Rodya! I knew nothing about it either," cried Razumihin. "I'll run to day to the reading room and ask for the number. 2 months ago! What was the date? It doesn't matter though, I will find it. Think of not telling us!" "How did you find out that the article was mine? It's only signed with an initial." "I only learnt it by chance the other day, through the editor. I know him. I was very much interested." "I analysed, if I remember, the psychology of a criminal before and after the crime." "Yes, and you maintain that the perpetration of a crime is always accompanied by illness. Very, very original. But it was not that part of your article that interested me so much, but an idea at the end of the article, which I regret to say you merely suggested without working it out clearly. There is, if you recollect, a suggestion that there are certain persons who can, that is, not precisely are able to, but have a perfect right to commit breaches of morality and crimes, and that the law is not for them." Raskolnikov smiled at the exaggerated and intentional distortion of his idea. "What? What do you mean? A right to crime? But not because of the influence of environment?" Razumihin inquired with some alarm even. "No, not exactly because of it," answered Porfiry. "In his article all men are divided into ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary men have to live in submission, have no right to transgress the law, because, don't you see, they are ordinary. But extraordinary men have a right to commit any crime, and to transgress the law in any way just because they are extraordinary. That was your idea, if I am not mistaken." "What do you mean? That can't be right," Razumihin muttered in bewilderment. Raskolnikov smiled again. He saw the point at once and knew where they wanted to drive him. He decided to take up the challenge. "That wasn't quite my contention," he began simply and modestly. "Yet I admit that you have stated it almost correctly, perhaps if you like perfectly so." It almost gave him pleasure to admit this. "The only difference is that I don't contend that extraordinary people are always bound to commit breaches of morals, as you call it. In fact, I doubt whether such an argument could be published. I simply hinted that an extraordinary man has the right, that is, not an official right, but an inner right to decide in his own conscience to overstep certain obstacles, and only in case it is essential for the practical fulfilment of his idea, sometimes, perhaps, of benefit to the whole of humanity. You say that my article isn't definite. I am ready to make it as clear as I can. Perhaps I am right in thinking you want me to. Very well. I maintain that if the discoveries of Kepler and Newton could not have been made known except by sacrificing the lives of one, a dozen, 100, or more men, Newton would have had the right, would indeed have been in duty bound, to eliminate the dozen or the 100 men for the sake of making his discoveries known to the whole of humanity. But it does not follow from that Newton had a right to murder people right and left and to steal every day in the market. Then, I remember, I maintain in my article that all, well, legislators and leaders of men, such as Lycurgus, Solon, Mahomet, Napoleon, and so on, were all without exception criminals, from the very fact that making a new law they transgressed the ancient one, handed down from their ancestors and held sacred by the people. And they did not stop short at bloodshed either, if that bloodshed, often of innocent persons fighting bravely in defence of ancient law, were of use to their cause. It's remarkable, in fact, that the majority, indeed, of these benefactors and leaders of humanity were guilty of terrible carnage. In short, I maintain that all great men, or even men a little out of the common, that is to say, capable of giving some new word, must from their very nature be criminals, more or less, of course. Otherwise it's hard for them to get out of the common rut, and to remain in the common rut is what they can't submit to, from their very nature again, and to my mind they ought not indeed to submit to it. You see that there is nothing particularly new in all that. The same thing has been printed and read 1,000 times before. As for my division of people into ordinary and extraordinary, I acknowledge that it's somewhat arbitrary, but I don't insist upon exact numbers. I only believe in my leading idea that men are in general divided by a law of nature into two categories: inferior, ordinary, that is, so to say, material that serves only to reproduce its kind, and men who have the gift or the talent to utter a new word. There are, of course, innumerable subdivisions, but the distinguishing features of both categories are fairly well marked. The first category, generally speaking, are men conservative in temperament and law-abiding. They live under control and love to be controlled. To my thinking, it is their duty to be controlled, because that's their vocation, and there is nothing humiliating in it for them. The second category all transgress the law. They are destroyers or disposed to destruction according to their capacities. The crimes of these men are of course relative and varied. For the most part they seek in very varied ways the destruction of the present for the sake of the better. But if such a one is forced for the sake of his idea to step over a corpse or wade through blood, he can, I maintain, find within himself, in his conscience, a sanction for wading through blood, that depends on the idea and its dimensions, note that. It's only in that sense I speak of their right to crime in my article. You remember it began with the legal question. There's no need for such anxiety, however. The masses will scarcely ever admit this right. They punish them or hang them, more or less, and in doing so fulfil quite justly their conservative vocation. But the same masses set these criminals on a pedestal in the next generation and worship them, more or less. The first category is always the man of the present, the second the man of the future. The first preserve the world and people it, the second move the world and lead it to its goal. Each class has an equal right to exist. In fact, all have equal rights with me, and vive la guerre éternelle, till the New Jerusalem, of course. Then you believe in the New Jerusalem, do you? I do, Raskolnikov answered firmly. As he said these words and during the whole preceding tirade, he kept his eyes on one spot on the carpet. And... and do you believe in God? Excuse my curiosity. I do, repeated Raskolnikov, raising his eyes to Porfiry. And do you believe in Lazarus rising from the dead? I do. Why do you ask all this? You believe it literally? Literally. You don't say so. I asked from curiosity, excuse me, but let us go back to the question. They are not always executed. Some, on the contrary... Triumph in their lifetime? Oh, yes. Some attain their ends in this life, and then... They begin executing other people? If it's necessary. Indeed, for the most part they do. Your remark is very witty. Thank you. But tell me this, how do you distinguish those extraordinary people from the ordinary ones? Are there signs at their birth? I feel there ought to be more exactitude, more external definition. Excuse the natural anxiety of a practical law-abiding citizen, but couldn't they adopt a special uniform, for instance? Couldn't they wear something, be branded in some way? For you know, if confusion arises and a member of one category imagines that he belongs to the other, begins to eliminate obstacles as you so happily expressed it, then oh, that very often happens. That remark is wittier than the other. Thank you. No reason to, but take note that the mistake can only arise in the first category, that is among the ordinary people, as I perhaps unfortunately called them. In spite of their predisposition to obedience, very many of them, through a playfulness of nature, sometimes vouchsafed even to the cow, like to imagine themselves advanced people, destroyers, and to push themselves into the new movement, and this quite sincerely. Meanwhile, the really new people are very often unobserved by them, or even despised as reactionaries of grovelling tendencies. But I don't think there is any considerable danger here, and you really need not be uneasy, for they never go very far. Of course, they might have a thrashing sometimes for letting their fancy run away with them and to teach them their place, but no more. In fact, even this isn't necessary as they castigate themselves, for they are very conscientious. Some perform this service for one another, and others chastise themselves with their own hands. They will impose various public acts of penitence upon themselves, with a beautiful and edifying effect. In fact, you've nothing to be uneasy about, it's a law of nature." "Well, you have certainly set my mind more at rest on that score. But there's another thing worries me. Tell me, please, are there many people who have the right to kill others, these extraordinary people? I am ready to bow down to them, of course, but you must admit it's alarming if there are a great many of them, eh?" "Oh, you needn't worry about that either," Raskolnikov went on in the same tone. "People with new ideas, people with the faintest capacity for saying something new, are extremely few in number, extraordinarily so, in fact. One thing only is clear, that the appearance of all these grades and subdivisions of men must follow with unfailing regularity some law of nature. That law, of course, is unknown at present, but I am convinced that it exists, and one day may become known. The vast mass of mankind is mere material, and only exists in order by some great effort, by some mysterious process, by means of some crossing of races and stocks, to bring into the world at last perhaps one man out of 1,000 with a spark of independence. 1 in 10,000 perhaps, I speak roughly, approximately, is born with some independence, and with still greater independence 1 in 100,000. The man of genius is one of millions, and the great geniuses, the crown of humanity, appear on earth perhaps one in many thousand millions. In fact, I have not peeped into the retort in which all this takes place. But there certainly is and must be a definite law. It cannot be a matter of chance." "Why, are you both joking?" Razumihin cried at last. "There you sit, making fun of one another. Are you serious, Rodya?" Raskolnikov raised his pale and almost mournful face and made no reply. And the unconcealed, persistent, nervous and discourteous sarcasm of Porfiry seemed strange to Razumihin beside that quiet and mournful face. "Well, brother, if you are really serious... You are right, of course, in saying that it's not new, that it's like what we've read and heard 1,000 times already. But what is really original in all this, and is exclusively your own, to my horror, is that you sanction bloodshed in the name of conscience, and, excuse my saying so, with such fanaticism. That, I take it, is the point of your article. But that sanction of bloodshed by conscience is, to my mind, more terrible than the official legal sanction of bloodshed." "You are quite right, it is more terrible," Porfiry agreed. "Yes, you must have exaggerated. There is some mistake, I shall read it. You can't think that! I shall read it." "All that is not in the article, there's only a hint of it," said Raskolnikov. "Yes, yes," Porfiry couldn't sit still. "Your attitude to crime is pretty clear to me now. But, excuse me for my impertinence, I'm really ashamed to be worrying you like this. You see, you've removed my anxiety as to the two grades getting mixed. but there are various practical possibilities that make me uneasy. What if some man or youth imagines that he is a Lycurgus or Mahomet, a future one of course, and suppose he begins to remove all obstacles? He has some great enterprise before him and needs money for it, and tries to get it, do you see?" Zametov gave a sudden guffaw in his corner. Raskolnikov did not even raise his eyes to him. "I must admit," he went on calmly, "that such cases certainly must arise. The vain and foolish are particularly apt to fall into that snare, young people especially." "Yes, you see. Well then?" "What then?" Raskolnikov smiled in reply. "That's not my fault. So it is and so it always will be. He said just now," he nodded at Razumihin, "that I sanction bloodshed. Society is too well protected by prisons, banishment, criminal investigators, penal servitude. There's no need to be uneasy, you have but to catch the thief." "And what if we do catch him?" "Then he gets what he deserves." "You are certainly logical, but what of his conscience?" "Why do you care about that?" "Simply from humanity. If he has a conscience, he will suffer for his mistake, that will be his punishment, as well as the prison." "But the real geniuses?" asked Razumihin, frowning. "Those who have the right to murder. Oughtn't they to suffer at all, even for the blood they've shed?" "Why the word 'ought'? It's not a matter of permission or prohibition. He will suffer if he is sorry for his victim. Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. The really great men must, I think, have great sadness on earth," he added dreamily, not in the tone of the conversation. He raised his eyes, looked earnestly at them all, smiled and took his cap. He was too quiet by comparison with his manner at his entrance, and he felt this. Everyone got up. "Well, you may abuse me, be angry with me if you like," Porfiry Petrovitch began again, "but I can't resist. Allow me one little question, I know I am troubling you. There is just one little notion I want to express, simply that I may not forget it." "Very good. Tell me your little notion." Raskolnikov stood waiting, pale and grave before him. "Well, you see, I really don't know how to express it properly. It's a playful, psychological idea. When you were writing your article, surely you couldn't have helped fancying yourself, just a little, an extraordinary man, uttering a new word in your sense. That's so, isn't it?" "Quite possibly," Raskolnikov answered contemptuously. Razumihin made a movement. "And, if so, could you bring yourself in case of worldly difficulties and hardship, or for some service to humanity, to overstep obstacles, for instance to rob and murder?" And again he winked with his left eye and laughed noiselessly just as before. "If I did, I certainly should not tell you," Raskolnikov answered with defiant and haughty contempt. "No, I was only interested on account of your article, from a literary point of view." "Foo! How obvious and insolent that is!" Raskolnikov thought with repulsion. "Allow me to observe," he answered dryly, "that I don't consider myself a Mahomet or a Napoleon, nor any personage of that kind, and not being one of them I cannot tell you how I should act." "Oh, come, don't we all think ourselves Napoleons now in Russia?" Porfiry Petrovitch said with alarming familiarity. Something peculiar betrayed itself in the very intonation of his voice. "Perhaps it was one of these future Napoleons who did for Alyona Ivanovna last week," Zametov blurted out from the corner. Raskolnikov did not speak, but looked firmly and intently at Porfiry. Razumihin was scowling gloomily. He seemed before this to be noticing something. He looked angrily around. There was a minute of gloomy silence. Raskolnikov turned to go. "Are you going already?" Porfiry said amiably, holding out his hand with excessive politeness. "Very, very glad of your acquaintance. As for your request, have no uneasiness, write just as I told you. Or, better still, come to me there yourself in a day or two. To morrow, indeed. I shall be there at 11 o'clock for certain. We'll arrange it all. We'll have a talk. As one of the last to be there, you might perhaps be able to tell us something," he added with a most good-natured expression. "You want to cross-examine me officially in due form?" Raskolnikov asked sharply. "Oh, why? That's not necessary for the present. You misunderstand me. I lose no opportunity, you see, and... I've talked with all who had pledges. I obtained evidence from some of them, and you are the last. Yes, by the way," he cried, seemingly suddenly delighted, "I just remember what was I thinking of." He turned to Razumihin. "You were talking my ears off about that Nikolay. Of course, I know very well," he turned to Raskolnikov, "that the fellow is innocent, but what is one to do? We had to trouble Dmitri, too. This is the point, this is all. When you went up the stairs, it was past 7, wasn't it?" "Yes," answered Raskolnikov, with an unpleasant sensation at the very moment he spoke that he need not have said it. "Then when you went upstairs between 7 and 8, didn't you see in a flat that stood open on a second storey, do you remember, 2 workmen? Or at least one of them. They were painting there, didn't you notice them? It's very, very important for them." "Painters? No, I didn't see them," Raskolnikov answered slowly, as though ransacking his memory, while at the same instant he was racking every nerve, almost swooning with anxiety, to conjecture as quickly as possible where the trap lay, and not to overlook anything. "No, I didn't see them, and I don't think I noticed a flat like that open. But on the 4th storey" he had mastered the trap now and was triumphant "I remember now that someone was moving out of the flat opposite Alyona Ivanovna. I remember it clearly. Some porters were carrying out a sofa and they squeezed me against the wall. But painters? No, I don't remember that there were any painters, and I don't think that there was a flat open anywhere. No, there wasn't." "What do you mean?" Razumihin shouted suddenly, as though he had reflected and realised. "Why, it was on the day of the murder the painters were at work and he was there 3 days before. What are you asking?" "Foo! I have muddled it!" Porfiry slapped himself on the forehead. "Deuce take it! This business is turning my brain," he addressed Raskolnikov somewhat apologetically. "It would be such a great thing for us to find out whether anyone had seen them between 7 and 8 at the flat, so I fancied you could perhaps have told us something. I quite muddled it." "Then you should be more careful," Razumihin observed grimly. The last words were uttered in the passage. Porfiry Petrovitch saw them to the door with excessive politeness. They went out into the street gloomy and sullen, and for some steps they did not say a word. Raskolnikov drew a deep breath. Chapter 6.